Let's go, folks. Welcome to the show. This is Common Threads. We are live doing this live from Brooklyn, New York every Thursday night. We are streaming live on Twitch, YouTube, Rumble, and X. 2 guests, 1 hour, lots of topics, maybe a little bit of fun as well. It is the greatest show of all time. That's what many people are saying. That's what I heard, the greatest political debate show of all time. I'm not saying that. Many people out there are saying it. Truly, my friends, a show like no other, because you help us decide the topics as we go along. Down there in the bottom right hand of your screen, you will see a QR code. What do you want to see our guest tonight debate as the third and final topic? I don't know how much extra context I should give. Just Trump's sketchy offerings. I'm not going to tell you anything more about what that is, but it's a really good topic. Or Elon Musk's growing influence, the federal government, politics, other things there as well. You got a good chunk of the show here to scan that QR code in the corner. Now the side of your screen. Hey, 1 vote there at the gate for, I think that's my mom. Thanks for that, Mom, who's watching the show at home. She's a big fan of that particular topic. And then also throughout the show, join in on the conversation. We will be featuring your comments live, a debate show unlike any other you've seen. We put up your comments. We interrupt the guests respectfully from time to time, have them answer your questions directly, and we're going to have a lot of fun in the process as well. We are going to kick off the broadcast here tonight with a little bit of breaking news that's just developed before the show started. The local International Longmen's Association, that's of course the ILA Workers Union, telling News 2 Charleston within the last hour or so, the port strike is over. Workers are expected to return back to work tomorrow. That's Friday. The ILA's got tens of thousands of members. They've been on strike the last 2 days, the first large-scale stoppage in nearly 50 years. On the other side of this debate has been the United States Maritime Alliance, known as the USMX. They represent port employers, a lot of whom are a lot of these foreign corporations. This has been central to the debate over the last few weeks, reaching ahead here the last 48 hours. Kenneth Riley, the international VP of the union, saying we came up with a deal today with the assistance of the Biden White House, Secretary Buttigieg, and lots of others instrumental in getting all of the parties together. Negotiations for other items will continue over the next 90 days, but as of now, dock workers will return to work. No one is happier than that than the president himself, Joe Biden, who is certainly dealing with an election headache, pinning different forces together in the days before the election. Time now to bring in our guests and kick off the show here with our first topic. We're joined tonight by Jonae Wartel. Jonae is a Democratic strategist, a partner at ARC Initiatives, and former Georgia Senate runoff director. It's great to have her on the program this evening, as it is Rich Rubino. Rich is a political analyst and author of The Great American Political Trivia Challenge. Rich, you're a big political trivia fan.
Yes, absolutely. I have that kind of monomaniacal interest in political trivia that nobody else has.
Well, I have to ask before we start the show, Rich, do you have a favorite piece of political trivia?
Oh, absolutely. Which United States president, who is largely forgotten in the United States, is an absolute folk hero in the country of Paraguay?
A folk hero in the country of Paraguay? Jonae, I'm going to bring you in. Do you have any guesses? I've got a stab. I have no idea.
I'm stumped.
It's not somebody you would think of. Who's the most obscure president you can think of?
I'll let Jonae go. Most obscure president?
I'm gonna go ahead and say not an obscure president. I can only think of the most popular president off of a couple. I'm just gonna say Truman.
Nope.
Truman's a good guess. Most obscure president to me, period, would be Franklin Pierce.
Very close, but no.
I have no idea if that's right. What's the answer?
Rutherford Berkshire Hayes.
Wait, that's his middle. That's what B stands for in Rutherford B. Hayes.
The Rutherford B. Hayes fans out there, yes. The reason is because when he was president back then, there was no such thing as a League of Nations. There was no such thing as the United Nations. So consequently, countries would sometimes come to the United States and ask them to use their good offices to negotiate some sort of an agreement. So Paraguay and Argentina, there was this land called the Chaco Territory. They came to Rutherford B. Hayes. By all accounts, Hayes did very little. He just basically delegated it to his Secretary of State, William Evarts. He worked on it, and they negotiated an agreement, and 60% of the land Paraguay owns today is because of that agreement. Consequently, if you go to Paraguay, they have a soccer team named after him. They have a school named after him. They have a national holiday for him. And there was actually a young girl who was in a coma for 2 years. She came out, a television station gave her one wish, and her one wish was to go to Delaware to visit the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum.
There are fun facts, and then there's all of that, which is a whole new territory of it. Also, Rutherford B. Hayes, if I'm not mistaken, one of only 5 U.S. presidents with a beard.
Yes.
I think there's only been 5.
And the only one born in Delaware.
And the only one born in Delaware. See, listen, we could do an entire spin-off show of Common Threads, which are just like really nerdy, really wonky presidential history. And to the point of presidential history, Jonae and I were talking about this before us. And Rich, I think you'll like this here. Of course, over Jonae's shoulder, the great Shirley Chisholm.
That, yes.
There it is. Unbought and unbossed. Jonae, that's absolutely awesome.
Thank you.
All right, let's get going here with the first topic here, and it's about safety and geopolitics. It has been such an important story of the week. Certainly something we felt like we need to address. Multiple threats on different fronts. The Middle East inching closer to a full-blown regional war after Iran fired ballistic missiles at Israel this week, the largest ever attack of this kind. A lot of questions remaining about how exactly Israel may respond, but we are seeing the key presidential figures taking slightly different approaches to this. First, here's the incumbent, soon to be out of office, Joseph Robinette Biden. He said online, this morning, Vice President Harris and I convened our national security team. There's the tweet. We discussed how the U.S. is prepared to help Israel defend against these attacks and protect American personnel in the region. Then we had Vice President Harris herself, the Democratic nominee, sounding off in our nation's capital earlier this week. Take a listen.
This attack unequivocally. I'm clear-eyed. Iran is a destabilizing, dangerous force in the Middle East, and today's attack on Israel only further demonstrates that fact.
So Biden and Harris, they're both very much playing the typical diplomatic game. You're walking the fine line of diplomacy. You're very careful with what you say. You're much more careful with everything you don't say. And then you've got the former president and Republican nominee Donald Trump taking a little bit of a different approach. Here's the former president.
And Iran thinks Harris is so incompetent. New intel shows they're trying to help Harris win the election. America doesn't need another TikTok performer. We need the strength that will protect us.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Obviously, that's the campaign message. Trump also went out to say the world's on fire, spiraling out of control, going on to slam Harris and Biden. Jonae, we add this into other growing geopolitical threats, Russia's war in Ukraine, the risk from China. Obviously here, two very different tones, two approaches from the two candidates here. Jonae, even if Trump tends to lean into the chaos a little bit more, I think there's something to be said about his outsider status that still resonates with millions of people. They don't want the status quo anymore. They don't necessarily want politics as usual. How do you see this, and how do you sort of put into context the approach that Trump is willing to have, which clearly does resonate with a lot of people on this issue?
Well, I think the issue of national security is one where you see a clear contrast between former President Trump and Vice President Harris. You see Vice President Harris unequivocally condemning these attacks and really taking national security and calling out threats, the threat that Iran has presented on the world stage as a real place for concern. Whereas you see Donald Trump really using this as an opportunity to really use national security as a partisan football, right? Really using it as an opportunity to attack Vice President Harris instead of taking a presidential stance on foreign policy. And we've seen Donald Trump perform as on the world stage and how he deals with national security, how he deals with foreign leaders. Under the Donald Trump presidency, we were not the leader, not the world leader that we all have been seen as, we currently are and have been seen as prior to his presidency. He uses these opportunities to cozy up to dictators, to create an unstable world national security environment. And so when you look at the contrast between these two candidates, particularly on how they respond to an attack like this one, you can see that one takes foreign policy very seriously and understands the role of commander in chief, and another, he uses it to attack his opponent and create another partisan issue where national security should be something that both sides and both parties are unequivocally serious about and focused on as an issue. We saw Vice President Harris go on to talk about how Iran is a destabilizing force on the world stage. She went on to ensure that we are reinforcing our position as someone who supports Israel's right to defend herself. And I think that is really where you want a presidential candidate of either party to take a stance. And we don't see that from former President Trump.
Rich, I wonder how you view this here. Obviously, you're dealing with a Republican nominee who now for the better part of the last 10 years has intentionally done things differently. To Jonae's point, he's been very clear to say, I'm going to criticize my allies. I might cozy up with some of the adversaries of the world. He might kind of frame that as like, hey, that's just consensus building around the world. I'm willing to have conversations with people in a way that other presidents have. How do you see this playing out? And why isn't it better to have an approach the way Harris and Biden do have, which is, hey, there's a reason that U.S. presidents in history, president after president, regardless of party, have tended to deal with some of these thorny geopolitical issues in one way, and that way is not the way that Donald Trump does things.
It's interesting. Every Republican president or presidential nominee from Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 through Mitt Romney in 2012 was basically an internationalist to some degree and basically an interventionist overseas. Trump came in 2016 with a completely different message. He talked about essentially America taking care of its own. He had a much more of a non-interventionist approach. And he talks about bringing peace. He was willing to meet. It's really called realpolitik, the idea that you essentially meet somebody. You don't necessarily have to like them, but you meet with them because you have shared interests. So consequently, he lands up meeting with the leader of North Korea. He lands up having a relatively cozy relationship with Vladimir Putin in Russia. He praises autocrats around the world. It's really just a different approach to foreign policy. Now, if you take that approach to a foreign policy, then theoretically, I think it's kind of a blind spot in the Middle East because he has a different view when it comes to issues like Israel, like Iran. He has a very bellicose, particularly Iran, he has very bellicose rhetoric. And for example, bringing the sanctions back, the sanctions were taken off as part of the deal negotiated during the Obama administration with the Iranian mullahs, or the Iranian regime rather. So it's just an interesting, it's a different approach. But you would think that if he was being consistent, that he would also be willing to meet with an emissary for Iran to try to somehow if not, if he didn't like the deal that it was negotiated under the Obama administration, he would try to somehow renegotiate that. Instead, he's using kind of bellicose rhetoric, and this really kind of takes him off of his message that he's the first president, he says, since the 30s, but it's really since Jimmy Carter, who did not send U.S. troops into a conflict. So it's really kind of contradicts, I think, the ideology that he's really presented himself and brought to the floor as the new version of the Republican Party.
Jonae, given your many years of work dealing with Democratic politics, particularly at the local level, I think all of us could easily argue, okay, you're coming up to a presidential election. It's the kitchen table issues that matter the most. It's how much my groceries are, how much am I paying at the pump, how safe and secure do I feel in my well-being in my community. But I wonder, in your years, especially in Georgia, Jonae, how have you seen voters frame or discuss big geopolitical issues that clearly get talked a lot about, but I wouldn't put it past the average American is not super tuned into the nuances of geopolitical warfare. But I wonder, in your years, especially in a place like Georgia, have you seen voters from time to time say, hey, actually, this is much more of an issue for me, this particular cycle in this moment with the world in this tinderbox type of environment than it ever was before?
Well, I think that voters are paying a lot more attention to issues of national security because we're seeing more of these conflicts in modern day really play out on the national stage. The media is covering it, right? We're learning about, the attack on Israel back last year. This is something that for this generation of folks who are paying attention to politics is something that's seared in their memory, right? And so we think about how this generation of young people, of people of all generations, how we are seeing these national conflicts play out, or these international conflicts play out, and how does that position the U.S. in terms of its foreign policy, and kind of what side are we on? What position are we taking? Where are we sending aid? Who are our allies? Who are our enemies? So I think it brings that conversation to the forefront. I don't think it's to downplay the issues that people care about most, the everyday issues of the economy, making sure that they, have opportunities to pursue jobs and to have a fair and living wage and to take care of their families and to be able to afford health care. But I think that these issues of foreign policy really come into view. And I think for voters, what's top of mind to them is like, how is the United States seen on the world stage? And what kind of leader do we want to lead us on the world stage? And you look at the 4 years of the Trump presidency, where the United States was a laughingstock in many regards because of the way that Donald Trump approached foreign policy, because of the way that he dealt with dictators. And even as he left office, you saw that a number of foreign leaders really did come out and publicly say that they did not have, the respect for former President Trump. And so we see that image does matter, right? Because we are seen as the United States as a world leader. And so I do think that plays into kind of how voters see politics and how voters see politicians.
We got a comment here from Chris who says, we live in an era where wars are broadcast live on Twitch. I mean, that could very well be kind of how things play out here. Rich, as Jonae was talking about there, I was reminded of Trump's relationships at time with people that I think most Americans would say are not good leaders. I was there in Helsinki, Finland. I was working as a White House reporter at the time when Trump had that infamous Putin summit. There was this whole soccer ball thing, and Putin's like, the ball's in your court. And like the whole controversy was Donald Trump's inability to side with his own national security apparatus that said, hey, we know Russia is a bad actor for XYZ. And when asked about it directly, standing a few feet away from Vladimir Putin, he says, basically, I don't know. I've heard it both ways. Maybe they got a point. Maybe our national security is wrong. Rich, given that you are the fan of history that you are, is there any historical precedence to this? I mean, have you, as you watch Trump especially deal with our adversaries on the world stage, is there another presidency you think of and say, hey, this is not dissimilar from so-and-so, and here's how those things played out?
No, not really. There were presidential candidates. I think Barry Goldwater, who ran in 1964 as the Republican Party nominee, comes to mind. He used to make fun of, for example, wanting to lob a nuclear bomb and have it go right into the restroom of the Kremlin, for example. I mean, obviously some of those were jokes, but it was very much It was very much bellicose type of rhetoric, where he used to say that he wants to saw off the eastern part of the United States. But I think that the difference between Goldwater and Trump is that when Goldwater was in the Senate, when he was behind closed doors, he was making deals. He was actually, his best friend was Hubert Humphrey, the 1968 Democratic nominee. He was friends with George McGovern, who had a completely divergent view of him on the Vietnam War specifically. But when he ran in 1964, because of his rhetoric, a lot of traditional Republicans landed up actually supporting, although reluctantly, current President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And a lot of Republicans like George Romney, running for re-election as governor of Michigan, tried to distance himself. He actually sent out sample ballots to people showing how you can vote for Lyndon Johnson, the Democrat, and George Romney, the Republican. Where Trump is different is that he has made the ideology of the Republican Party in his own name. Anybody who took the Republican position from Eisenhower on trade through Romney on trade, on immigration and on foreign intervention is now a quote-unquote RINA, a Republican in name only. He's made it so that if you don't support essentially where Trump is on those three kind of flagship issues and pretty much just about everything else, you are no longer a Republican. So now we have a scenario, and I think back all the time to 2005, 2006, whoever would have thought that the Democratic presidential nominee would star in a presidential debate and the vice presidential nominee would star in the vice presidential debate, the endorsement of one Dick Cheney. Now imagine if, say, 2008, Barack Obama had said, I have the endorsement of Dick Cheney. Now Dick Cheney, because of where Trump has changed the Republican Party, now feels more comfortable supporting Vice President Harris than does President Trump. And you heard Governor Walz say in one of the debates, we have a very interesting coalition. You have Bernie Sanders on the one hand, you have Taylor Swift, and you have Dick Cheney. Now, who would ever think that Dick Cheney and Bernie Sanders would both be starred by the Democratic presidential nominee? But here we are. This is the current state of the body politic.
Yeah, that's my dream, party right there. I want Taylor Swift, invite 3 celebrities to a party. Who do you want? It includes Taylor Swift, Bernie Sanders,
I know
and
Mitch
Dick
McConnell's
Cheney,
a real party animal, too.
Could very well be. I mean, listen, wait, actually, was today the, was tonight the Liz Cheney Harris
event?
In
Wisconsin. And she mentioned Dick Cheney's name, and Dick Cheney got an applause from a mostly Democratic audience. Whoever would have thought?
Jonae, what does that say to you? I mean, I don't know if it's more about Harris' appeal or more about Trump's lack of appeal. And also, Jonae, how many Republican voters out there are anywhere in this, Cheney, Nikki Haley Venn diagram of hey, I love conservative politics, love Ronald Reagan, small government, XYZ, can't stand Trump?
Well, it's a bit of both. When you look at this coalition that the Harris campaign has really put together, it is, yes, your traditional Democratic base voters. It's your undecided or your persuadable voters, maybe people who are single issue voters, reproductive freedom, women's health care, maybe you're voting in the economy. But then also you look at the coalition of Republican voters that the Harris-Walz campaign has been able to bring into the fold. And you also think about that being the margin of victory in a lot of these key battleground states where the margin will be slim. In Georgia, winning the state by less than 12,000 votes, President Biden did. These could be the voters in these suburban areas, in these slightly more conservative areas where people are rejecting Trumpism. They're rejecting extremism. They're rejecting this ticket and what the Republican Party has become in some regards. And I think it was just said a moment ago that, folks are rejecting this idea that the politics need to be extreme, that the rhetoric needs to be extreme, but rather that there's some sensibility in what they're hearing the Harris-Walz campaign say about how to grow the economy, about how to create an opportunity economy, about how to, ensure that we can grow small businesses. There's some sensibility to the politics, and that's how you bring together coalitions, talking about issues that people care about at their core, and not these extreme fringe issues and these extreme fringe positions that we see Donald Trump and the Republican Party and J.D. Vance taking. And, one thing that also struck me about, the 2022 election, we saw how much reproductive freedom and reproductive justice was an issue that Republicans were losing on. The polling showed them losing on this issue. And then look at 2022 when they didn't make, the kind of gains that they wanted to. You see that they were doubling down on a losing issue for them. And so you saw their ability to reach out to these moderate voters start to slim a bit, because you saw that when people were given the choice between freedom and restrictions, freedom and having the government tell them what to do, people chose to vote for a party that promoted freedom. And so we saw kind of these traditional swing voters moving closer to voting for Democrats. But then you also saw that kind of in return, the Republican base became a little bit more conservative and really embraced, J.D. Vance and the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and people who have more extreme positions. So I think they lost a bit of their ability to appeal to the middle by embracing some of these extreme policies that are not popular amongst the American people.
We're going to pull up this comment here from Courtney, which says, seems like TikTok potentially getting taken away has been the eye-opener, at least for younger Americans, she says, when it comes to national security. I think that's more of a China thing, which is important, right? Because remember, that sort of kicked off this entire social media campaign, especially among younger, potentially first-time voters. Obviously, there was a lot of bipartisan support there. So a fascinating conversation. We're going to roll along now in the show here to the next thing. And thank you, of course, to all of our many viewers who are submitting questions. Please keep doing so. And as a reminder, scan the QR code there on the side of your screen to help us decide the final topic. The votes are rolling in. They're flying. Courtney also says Mark Cuban even recently said he voted for Trump the first time and switched to Biden as the Democratic Party was aligning more with his ideologies. Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, quick, Rich, let me get you to comment on that. Obviously, I think there's a lot of high-profile celebrities, especially in the tech and business world. They're siding with Biden, but you do have people like Mark Cuban that are saying, no, it's actually Harris who's trying to position herself more as the pro-capitalist candidate. What do you think there, Rich?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I wouldn't even say pro-capitalist candidate as much as I would say and this is more Tim Walz than here, more of a libertarian, if you will. And a lot of younger voters are somewhat libertarian, specifically on social issues. And when Tim Walz says, mind your own damn business, that's not something you would traditionally hear from a Democrat. Now, on fiscal issues, the party is certainly to the left of center, but I think on a lot of social issues, they're basically saying that we don't want the kind of magisterial or paternalistic hand of government in reproductive decisions, for example. So I think they're kind of taking that young voters' kind of ethos, wanting some sort of a libertarian, some sort of, I guess you'd say, a domestic or a social libertarianism. And I think they're kind of trying to promote that, but I don't necessarily see it as kind of a libertarian capitalism. That's where I think they're different, because they certainly do believe that the government should provide a helping hand for tax credits or that type of thing for home buyers, that type of thing. But there is definitely a libertarianism there.
Look at that. That was a whole accidental side quest topic that just came up because of Courtney, and I'm glad we could kick it over to our guest and have a good debate about it. Okay, continue to scan the QR code to choose the final topic of the show. Time now, if I'm not mistaken. Did I get this right? Is it time now for the fan favorite segment of the show? Yeah. I believe it is. Cue it up. Hey, let's do it. Tonight we take a look at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Senate race, one that could determine the balance of power in the high chamber next year. First, we'll take a look at the Real Clear Politics polling averages. This is Democratic incumbent Bob Casey holding a 4 percentage point lead. Did I get that right? 48.8. Oh, there we go. Over GOP challenger Dave McCormick. Remember, McCormick's the former CEO of Bridgewater Associates. As is the case in most places, wealthy out-of-state donors are helping shape the ads, the conversation, and the fundraising prowess of both campaigns. Even though McCormick's keeping things close and he has the endorsement of Donald Trump, of course, the betting markets right now see things playing out a bit differently. Our friends over at Polymarket, of course, one of the more popular event contract sites, they say Bob Casey right now, he's got this in the bag. That's at least what they say. 82% chance of holding on for a fourth term. Ironically, as you see here, Polymarket bettors also give Trump the advantage in Pennsylvania, meaning expectations for a lot of split ticket voters. According to the New York Times, across 5 states with competitive Senate races, Wisconsin, Arizona, PA, Ohio, and Michigan, an average of 7% of likely voters who plan to vote for Trump also say they plan to cast a ballot for a Democrat in the Senate election. Rich, first to you, expectations for how Pennsylvania plays out, either for the presidency or for that Bob Casey Senate race.
Senate race, I think Bob Casey has to be the clear favorite. He's somebody, and when he first ran for Senate, part of the reason folks like Chuck Schumer supported him is that they knew he was somebody who could appeal. You know, Pennsylvania, you have Pittsburgh on one side, Philadelphia on the other, and some very rural parts in between. He was somebody who could appeal to that constituency the same way his father did when his father was governor. So he gets elected in 2006, actually defeats Rick Santorum, has continued to get reelected. He's actually he used to be somewhat socially conservative. He's since moderated his views, but I certainly would give him the advantage. Now, in terms of Donald Trump, I think that Senator Casey will certainly be a few points ahead. He'll certainly run ahead of will certainly run ahead of Vice President Harris just because he knows the state. He does very well with kind of the blind spots of the Democratic Party, which is those kind of rural areas of Pennsylvania. In terms of the presidential race, I don't know. It's 19 electoral votes. It's probably the most important state in the entire country electorally. I do think that if it is very close, and I think it's probably unfairly, Vice President Harris will be blamed for not choosing Governor Shapiro as her vice presidential running mate. The thought process being that had she chosen, we potentially would have taken Pennsylvania. I think that argument probably is a little bit false, because you got to remember that very rarely do people actually vote for vice president based on the state somebody lives in. And Tim Walz is actually somebody who can appeal to conservative rural voters in parts of the Rust Belt and parts of those blue wall states, because he has that profile. I say he's an amalgamation between Hubert Humphrey and Bill Clinton in many respects. But that being said, it's going to be extreme. She will be blamed the way that Al Gore was blamed in 2000 for not choosing Florida Senator Bob Graham as his running mate if she does barely lose this Keystone State.
Jonae, over to you. I know you've done a lot of work in Georgia, but talk to me about how you see the campaigns in general, the Democratic Party messaging here to Pennsylvania. To Rich's point, 19 electoral votes. It's got to be the most important state here.
Absolutely.
Sure,
when
right?
you look at the path to 270 for Democrats and for Republicans, Pennsylvania is a must-win state. And the important thing to highlight, as was mentioned about the coalition of voters that it takes to win in Pennsylvania, is you have to have high turnout in the urban areas, especially for Democrats. And you've also got to continue winning those moderate voters in rural parts of Pennsylvania. You have to make sure that you're building that coalition to win. You can't win with any single one of those groups. You've got to have a coalition. And so I think it's a really great test case in how coalition building helps win a state. You see a lot of that same kind of coalition building in a lot of these key battleground states, kind of the same in Georgia, where you've got to win, your urban centers, but then you've also got to make sure that your moderate and your swing voters across the states or in more rural areas and suburban areas are being reached and engaged and are turning out to support. I think what's interesting here when you look at Bob Casey is, you look at him and he's, an incumbent. You see that he, has that incumbent advantage, has a really strong record of being an elected official in Pennsylvania. And so you see that he has a bit of an advantage going into this race. An incumbent advantage is pretty hard to erase. But I think this is really about do I trust the leadership or do I want to change candidate? And I think that in a lot of places you see the Senate map, you see this change candidate versus the kind of the status quo or the incumbent. And I think in an election where Democrats have shown proven leadership in a lot of these key battleground states, I think you see that the tide kind of flows with them because they have, popular incumbents. And so I think that you see that in Pennsylvania to a degree, but I do think you also have to be reminded that, Donald Trump has a tremendous amount of support in Pennsylvania, as he does in a lot of these battleground states. And so while we see that Democratic coalition building and see the investment of resources, if you're a Democratic campaign in that state, you have a big operation in Philly, but you're also reaching out to those moderate voters across the state. But you also see that the Trump base is very, very strong. And it's a machine that you can turn on pretty easily without doing extensive voter engagement and voter outreach. Those folks are reliable voters. So you really have to balance understanding kind of what it takes to win on both sides. But Pennsylvania is a fantastic test case.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And no two states are alike, but the comparisons between a place like Georgia, where Jonae has done so much work on the ground for years, and Pennsylvania cannot be ignored. Okay, time here now to move on to our second topic of the night, I believe, 8:30 and change. That brings us here. This week, the vice presidential debate was right here in New York City. The gloves were off. It was a fierce drag-down bout of two political heavyweights exchanging blows left and right. Fireworks in October. Take a look.
A showdown for the ages. Tim Walz.
We could come together.
Let me respond to that. First of all, Governor, I agree with you.
We're in agreement that we bring those home.
I agree with you. I think you want to solve this problem.
I agree with a lot of what Senator Vance said.
Governor Walz and I actually probably agree that we need to do better on this.
I agree with that. Well, we got close to an agreement because all those things are happening.
Tim just said something that I agree with. I actually agree with Tim Walz.
The rhetoric is good.
I'm sure Governor Walz joins me.
Much of what the senator said right there, I'm in agreement with him on this.
Oh, fierce politics at its best. The two of them duking it out. Very, very, very nice handshake. Shout out to Alexia, the team, for that, because that's awesome. That's absolutely awesome. Jonae, let me go back over to you. Do you see this as a bit of a preview? Because I feel like that's what everyone talked about after the VP debate. They're like, wow, these were two human beings who just, like, got along. They had differences. They were very cordial. It was very personal. They shook hands. Is this a bit of a preview of a return to normalcy for politics after Donald Trump stops running? Or do you think that the Trump brand of politics is here to stay?
Well, first I'll say that clip is pretty incredible. I think that it was a really fantastic and very interesting thing to watch, the vice presidential debate, because I think you saw a couple things. I think first you saw that JD Vance is truly a chameleon. He is somebody who can go on the road and be on the stump, really kind of pushing that very MAGA brand of politics, lots of extreme policies, unpopular views, talking about, cat ladies and how he's anti-abortion and bashing Kamala Harris and really kind of that red meat that I think that the base of folks who support Donald Trump have come to appreciate and respect and really embrace. But then you saw him on that debate stage last night, and it almost was kind of like he was kind of sanitizing a bit of kind of his previous image, right? You saw him sounding very sensible. You saw him making MAGA sound very logical. And so a lot of people kind of cocked their head to the side and said, like, who's this guy? He's not the guy we see on the stump, right? He's not the guy we see on the campaign trail. And I think it really did show how he can, in a way, turn it on and turn it off. And I think, when you look at the future of the Republican Party beyond Donald Trump, you're like, is this the next generation of MAGA, right? Is this someone who can make extremist policies, unpopular policies, things that when the president says it, it sounds kind of like this, very kind of polarizing rhetoric, and make it sound like something that people can embrace, sounds like something that we can kind of logically process and maybe find agreement with. And so I think that that's what we saw last night in JD Vance, and it's a little kind of scary to think he could be a heartbeat away from being the president of the United States. But then you also saw this kind of more agreeable, more polite and engaged Tim Walz, and you saw them finding such commonality in politics and, in their policies and saying, I agree with him. And, I agree with that point. And I think what you saw is like what which politics could be, right? People disagreeing without being disagreeable and nasty and tearing your opponent down and inciting, this kind of war of words. But I think that there was still such contrast there. If you looked really beyond kind of the niceties and the fact that they weren't screaming at each other or being nasty, you did still see a ton of contrast there. You did still see Governor Walz calling JD Vance out on not being able to say that Donald Trump lost the election, right? And it wasn't lost on me that showed his true colors. They showed that, at the end of the day, he would support someone who would destabilize democracy by potentially inciting violence if we were to lose. You saw somebody who ran away from his anti-choice rhetoric, his his anti-women's rights rhetoric, where he flat out lied and said he wasn't anti-women's rights, and he in fact was. And so you had to look very closely to see it. But I think the true storyline here is that JD Vance is a chameleon and he's pretty dangerous.
So, Rich, I mean, on a point of scoring, first of all, I agree with what you'd said earlier, Rich, which is, I don't really know how many people are going to sit there and watch the VP debate and say, aha, now I know who I'm going to vote for because of how a vice presidential debate went. And I don't mean any disrespect to all participants. I think all debates are good to have. But on a note of scoring, I would say, especially on style, I would give it to Vance. But to Jonae's point, the thing that bothers me the most is just, man, we're still living in this election denialism. And I know people are going to say, well, the media is making a big deal about it. The media should make a big deal about it if you still have an entire presidential campaign and a party apparatus, which is representing just about 50% of America, that's still living in some conspiratorial la-la land that the 2020 election was stolen, that it was rigged, that it was undemocratic. And I still sat there and I knew he wasn't going to do it. But, Rich, I was so disappointed in Senator Vance when that last thing came up at the end, and I know he walked right into the bear trap, and I know he can't say that Donald Trump was really, especially through the lens of history, am I overreacting to say that's such a pernicious lie to latch onto, to not even work in the base reality of how an election went, and have things like that happened in your journeys with presidential history that maybe I'm not
directly like this.
on.
Well, first of all, it is true that vice presidential debates, generally 2 or 3 days later, people completely forget about them. Nelson Rockefeller used to say that the vice presidency, I go to earthquakes and I go to funerals, and he said that it was basically standby equipment. So it's really, when people are running for vice president, people are voting for president, they're not voting for the vice presidential nominee. Now, maybe they'll help with a certain group. Maybe they'll ideologically balance a ticket, like when Jimmy Carter, for example, chose Walter Mondale in 1976. Carter was seen as being moderate to conservative. Mondale was one of the more liberal members. In 1992, Bill Clinton chose Al Gore. He tried to complement basically two Southern Christian, outer Southern states who had very moderate voting record, were very moderate in many respects, and were very young. So there are different ways you can do it, but people are generally voting for president, not for vice president. Now, in terms of JD Vance, first of all, I was surprised a little bit because in his past, you only have one record of him actually in a campaign, and that was 2022. And in both the primary and in the general election, he was extremely combative in both of them. Now, in 2022, he was running against Tim Ryan, who was a congressman from the Youngstown area, and they were running against each other. And Tim Ryan really took him to task, for example, on his past issues on abortion. JD Vance came back and took on Tim Ryan on his past voting for Nancy Pelosi. It was a very combative debate. I expected more of that. This time around, I think that my guess is his strategist told him that we have the base locked up. Conservative voters are absolutely incensed by the other side, and they're galvanized by us. We have to come out. What you have to do now is you have to move to the center, and you have to show that you're a conservative. You're somebody who's a conservative who has some sort of common sense, that type of thing. And I think that was kind of the message. So therefore, and you notice right at the beginning, after they went to Tim Walz gave his introductory remarks, kind of went after Trump a little bit. And then JD Vance immediately thanks Tim Walz for being there, which is something you really haven't seen since really the 2012 presidential elections, where the candidates kind of thank the moderators and that type of thing. Now, when he starts talking about the election and whether there was election fraud in 2020, he really has no room to go. He's really in kind of an ideological straitjacket. If he were to go and say something to the effect of, no, I don't think so, 2020 was a legitimate election, Joe Biden is our president, now we have to work to the future, there will be an absolute uproar on the right wing of the Republican Party and certainly the media sphere, and that is the last possible thing that he wants. Now, that being said, he does not, I think he would rather that question not be asked, and you can see by kind of the way he was kind of scrambling and moving around, and he was trying to do what any politician does. You try to answer the question in a sentence or two, and then you try to move on and talk about something else. But there's no way that Donald Trump would have selected somebody who would take an opposite position of him, because this is what Donald Trump has really been focusing on since 2020. This isn't the constitutional permissibility of the line item veto. I mean, these are major issues, and this is something that Donald Trump has made his campaign on, and there's really no going back whatsoever, which is probably why he did not choose other candidates who may have had a more moderate or establishment ethos or background in the United States Senate.
There's so oh man, we got to move on, but there's so much more I'd love to talk about this. We're gonna have you both on to talk more about this because it's really important. And I will simply say, I think the moment of humanity that shined through the most to me when Governor Walz revealed that his son, I believe he said, had been witness to a shooting. I was watching Senator Van react. He dropped his head. Walz gave an answer for a while. Vance very sincerely said, I can't believe you and your family went through that. And I was just like, man, we don't get this on the nationals. Okay, moving on with the show now with the remaining time we have left. We are in a neck and neck tie. This is like Mets-Brewers game 3 right now. It's like we're coming down to the wire. Which of these topics do you want to see our guests debate tonight? Tonight being October 3rd. And since it is October 3rd, let's talk about this next segment. This past week, Special Counsel Jack Smith provided the fullest picture yet of his 2020 election case against Donald Trump in a new filing. Some are calling it an October surprise. The big earth-shaking event in the final weeks, usually before a presidential campaign. But if history is any guide, we're likely in for maybe an even bigger October surprise between now and November 5th. Who could forget the chaotic October surprises of 2016? God, this is... I aged 10 years that 1 month. The infamous Access Hollywood tape of Donald Trump weeks later, then FBI Director James Comey reopening the email investigation into former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. In the year 2000, a few days before the election, it was revealed George W. Bush had been previously arrested many years before for drunk driving. October surprises hit midterm elections. Well, just ask Herschel Walker. His campaign for Senate in Georgia 2 years ago faced his personal history with abortion did not match that of his rhetoric. The term originates from 1980. Ronald Reagan campaign manager said that then incumbent Jimmy Carter might surprise everyone with a last-minute deal to release 52 American hostages held in Iran, leading to a boost in the polls. Today, the phrase October surprise means any late-breaking news item that upends an election. October apology.
Years ago, I made some mistakes. I occasionally drank too much, and I did on that night.
We are 11 days out from perhaps the most important national election of our lifetimes. The director himself has said he doesn't know whether the emails referenced in his letter are significant or not.
I've said and done things I regret, and the words released today on this more than a decade-old video are one of them. Bill Clinton has actually abused women, and Hillary has bullied, attacked, shamed, and intimidated his victims.
Jonae, first over to you. Given the electorate is already so split, how do you view these kind of late election changes, these October surprises? Keeping in mind, Hillary Clinton, even just a few days ago, said might happen sort of against Vice President Kamala Harris, seeing that Clinton herself went
a
through
number
this
of the
in
things that I had on my bingo card for this year have already happened for this election. I think we're already in kind of an unprecedented election cycle, given just kind of the dynamics of the race and how it's shaped up. I mean, I think what's important is for voters to be able to constantly see a contrast between the candidates. And I think that whatever, the Trump campaign or other Trump allies may choose to put forth or reveal or what revelations may come out, I think the contrast between the candidates is still very clear. I think that ultimately, we're not going to learn, I think, too many more things about these candidates that isn't already being discussed, that there isn't already an ad about. I mean, the Trump campaign has done its best to say everything about Vice President Harris that they possibly can. They've called her mentally ill. They've said she's just recently Black. I mean, the things that they've said have been kind of crazy. And so I don't imagine there's going to be anything that's revelatory in terms of what's said or what's brought forward that we haven't really already kind of litigated, discussed, and moved on from. So it's anyone's guess what the actual quote unquote October surprise will be if there is one. But I feel like we're playing in a pretty wide field right now when it comes to information about candidates on both sides.
That's really well said. We absolutely are. Rich, historically speaking, how big do these bump? I mean, obviously, we looked at Bush in 2000, didn't really matter. If the Access Hollywood tape from 2016, published by the Washington Post, did not prevent Donald Trump from the presidency. Rich, it's pretty hard to imagine anything derailing
Well, part of it,
anyone.
Donald Trump's strategy, and this is partly by Roger Stone, was the day that remember, there was a debate coming up between him and Hillary Clinton. And the day of the debate, he flew all the accusers for example, Kathleen Willey, Juanita Broderick, Paula Jones. He flew them to the debate. These were people who have accused Bill Clinton of sexual improprieties. And he held a press conference with them to try to take the heat, basically saying, I was just doing locker room talk when I said that, but this is what actually she was saying that Bill Clinton had done. And he took the story so that the next day people, and that night, for example, when they went around and Donald Trump was speaking, he would say, I Paula Jones, so I have in the audience, for example. And that was a strategy. So the next day, it was kind of, he neutralized the story. So that's part of, I think, how he did that. It was really kind of a brilliant ploy in terms of bringing them all to the debate. And he actually wanted them to, when you go out, the families all go out and they say hi to each other. That was at least the strategy at that debate. So Rudy Giuliani, who was working on the Trump case, wanted Juanita Broderick and Paula Jones and Kathleen Willey to come out and greet Bill Clinton and Chelsea Clinton. And the debate moderators at the last minute said no, which would have been an absolute disaster in many respects. In terms of these kind of late-term maneuvers, in terms of George W. Bush when he was in 2000 and the year 2000, when that came out, it was actually very interesting when it came out about his drunk driving past. That was also the same day, and at that same kind of impromptu press conference, he announced that he just received the support of Ross Perot, who was certainly a former Bush antagonist and somebody who had ran against his father. Many of Bush's allies blame Ross Perot for costing him the election. And then in 1994 had supported Ann Richards at the last minute in October against George W. Bush. In terms of some of these October surprises, I mean, I don't think that this is going to be something that's really going to change the needle, because people have so decided where they stand on Donald J. Trump right now. I cannot see that there is any voter whatsoever out there in the hinterlands that is saying, I was really thinking about voting for Donald Trump, but because this Jack Smith report, I think I'm going to go over and I'm going to vote for Vice President Harris. I just think the country is so bifurcated right now. And that's why last time around, 94% of Democrats voted for Joe Biden, 94% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump. And that's why I think we won't see a landslide election in the near future.
Yeah, we'll certainly see what happens. It's interesting to go from time to time and to revisit these little historical nuggets, and 'tis the season for an October surprise, regardless of what it is, which campaign, and then of course there's always the PR apparatus for response and how a campaign looks to get itself back. I had totally forgotten about that press conference, by the way, Rick. There's so much from 2016 I feel like I've just blocked out of my head.
A lot of people
it was just for like base survival. I was like, and now we're doing the show and I'm digging down through the history books again. I'm like, oh God, I totally forgot that happened. That's a thing our republic actually lived through. All right, folks, final moments here. What topic do you want to see voted on? Not by a landslide. Sometimes these are landslides. Sometimes there's like one really clear topic that comes out as the winner. Not tonight. 58.3% of the votes say we're going with the former president's sketchy offerings. This week, Donald Trump began promoting a new product to his millions of supporters. It was not a gold watch worth $1,000. It was not Trump-branded sneakers that are worth $400. It's a new cryptocurrency exchange, this is true, run by his sons. This was posted onto X. I promise to make America great again, this time with crypto. World Liberty Fi is planning. It seems grifty. I'm just going to call it what it is. Plan to help America, the crypto capital of the world. The whitelist, he wrote. I think he means waitlist. Kind of a Freudian slip. The whitelist for eligible persons is officially open. It's your chance to be a part of this historic moment. But here's the catch. CoinDesk reported this week a whopping 70% of these tokens will be reserved for project insiders. In other words, for executives. Not open to the public. Jonae, over to you. How much or how little do you think we should care about these kind of salesy side quests from the Republican nominee? It's not the type of stuff we usually see in presidential politics, and I feel like at this point we kind of shrug and we're like, all right, Trump's selling something else, but like a lot of these are objectively very bizarre.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we have to remember that like as recently as like 2021, he was like very against it and was very much like, oh, this is sketchy, this is obscure. He wasn't with it, right? He was actually like pretty much an outspoken critic. And so I think now that he's doing an about face in view of basically the fact that crypto could be, kind of the new thing, or it could really make a splash in the financial world and financial market. Now he's kind of making an about face on it. And I mean, that kind of flip-flopping a position, shouldn't really surprise anyone. We look at how, he's clearly, is clearly somebody who's driven by money, by assuming wealth, by amassing wealth, and by kind of being seen as this kind of leading businessman. So I don't think that there's any true surprise here. I think it's kind of a distraction, frankly. Here, I don't think folks should lean into it too terribly much, but to say that this is Donald Trump's way of kind of trying to still stay as the prominent businessman that people come to know him as, and he's capitalizing on any opportunity to do that.
Courtney in the comments asks, how is that even legal? It's a great question. I don't really know. I'm not going to pretend and understand that I totally grasp all of the complicated legal business entanglements and the rules. I just know when various people join the Trump organization, people will be like, are you disentangled from all of your business obligations and this and that? And a lot of it just kind of got buried under the rug. But Rich, ultimately, if voters vote for him, who cares? Right? Is that kind of part of this, which is like, hey, I'll sell watches and steaks and water bottles and get onto my very shady crypto exchange. No problem here. As long as the voters vote for him, does this type of stuff really matter?
That for anybody who this is an issue, and anybody who is very much offended by this is probably not going to vote for Donald Trump in the first place. So I can't imagine there being any voter, any MAGA voter out there somewhere that's saying, I really, really like Donald Trump, but because of this, I'm going to go over and I'm going to vote for Vice President Harris. I just don't see it. I think that I think that it's really going to come down at the end of the day. It's going to come down to turnout on both sides. How do you bring out low propensity vote Republicans for Trump? How do you bring out low propensity Democrats out for Vice President Harris? And how do you kind of appeal to the middle a little bit to try to get those tens of thousands of voters in those 7 swing states? But at the end of the day, this is really kind of de minimis, and I don't think it's going to be a voting issue.
Yeah, and you're right to point out the narrow margin of voters. And I'm just going to, by the way, this isn't promoted by vote.org, but if you're watching this and you don't know your registration status, please go to vote.org. It's free, it's fast, it's safe, it's secure, it's nonpartisan. And that 2016 election, as the three of us know, it was 77,000 votes total between Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Fewer people decided the entire election than who can fit into the big house, the football stadium in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And it underscores the importance of having conversations like this and making sure we all take advantage of that right and that opportunity to vote. We have to leave it there with our guest. I am so thankful for the time, the thoughtful and deliberate conversation. Jonae Wartel, Democratic strategist, partner at ARC Initiatives, former Georgia Senate runoff director, and Rich Rubino, political analyst and author of The Great American Political Trivia Challenge. We will be featuring trivia on the show every week now. Jonae, Rich, my thanks to you both.
Thank you so much
Thanks
for
a lot
having
for
us.
being here.
Thank you.
That was awesome. That's really how it's supposed to go. We envision the show. We're like, want thoughtful guests, respectful dialogue, find where they get along, be able to accentuate the key differences, but we keep it substantive. We have a bit of fun in the process. Alexi's dropping bombs from the back half of the room with his amazing graphics and videos. Let's bring in Taylor Craig. He's going to come in here and help clean up everything that I got wrong. Taylor, what did I botch up today on the show?
Oh, no, I don't think you messed anything up, man. It was as usual, a masterclass on the behalf of JD Durkin, but I thought that was a hell of a show. Alexi with the amazing mashup of that VP debate. You can't do much better than that. That was hilarious.
You can't. Taylor, I'm curious your thoughts on specifically a few of the things we talked about, but I feel like you've got thoughts on this Trump grifty salesmanship sort of thing. It just kind of reminds me of the gold and silver commercials you see promoted to you when you watch too much cable news. Right?
That's probably where he got a little bit of inspiration, right? We were joking that we should have a segment called Trump's Trench Coat. It seems like every week, he's putting out a new product. We had the watches. Yeah, exactly. Just like that. We had the watches that, you could just point to and grab this. And that goes back to Marco Rubio when he said Trump was if he didn't get a loan from his father, that's what he'd end up doing on a Manhattan street corner. But yeah, it's insane that he always has to go that route. Somebody who has all the connections that he has, it's surprising.
Carly Craig says she loves the show. Thanks, Carly. Appreciate your comment.
Great support.
One thing we didn't really get to talk about, Taylor, but when you and I talk about this a lot, is the Elon Musk overlap. It was sort of that last little bit we didn't get to, but I'm curious your thoughts because we've had a lot of great conversations about this as of late. I don't really remember a time when there's been such an outsized, influential, outside figure who could very well help determine largely how this election goes for so many different reasons. Like, this dude's involved with so much.
Yeah, Musk, I mean, we actually have a really interesting comment. I know you had an interview with the insider that used to be at Tesla. Why don't you cue that up? I can get that ready for you.
Yeah, I spoke a few days ago. This is Farzad Mazbahi, former Tesla insider, very prominent online and social media. He and I sat down for an interview on Leading Indicator over at public.com. We were talking all about Musk's roles, his different companies, and how much the federal government needs Elon Musk, right, for rockets and cool cars and maybe brain chips in the future. And yet politically, Musk is aligned much more with one side than the other. Here's what Farzad had to say.
I think as an individual, I think it aligns with the way he carries himself very closely. I think the way Elon Musk functions is that if he thinks something's very important and it's civilizational in nature, that he can't help himself but throw his head in the ring. Now you're talking about something that has moved from being objective, right? Whereas, you know, rockets landing is an objective, you're looking for an objective solution, right? It's physics. Same thing with electric vehicles, same thing with self-driving technology. When it comes to a moral compass, right, it's a lot more subjective in nature.
So, Taylor, I think that's the whole thing, right? It's that Elon Musk can position himself as this, like, bastion of free speech and this hero to bring all this, but it's like it's whatever he thinks is free speech, right? I think to Farzad's point.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating way that he's putting that. It's like the way his brain works is he just has to categorize something as an objective viewpoint. Everything has to come out objective. When you have something like politics that's inherently subjective and there's got to be gray area, it's you're like hitting what's the phrase when you take a hammer and you're hitting like the
nail on the head? Nail on the head?
Oh, you're like trying to hit like
what are we going with here?
When you're a hammer, you think everything is a nail. That's what it is.
Let's figure this out. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, you think everything is a nail. Like, he just can't apply the logic that made all of his companies so successful to something like politics, which requires nuance and just sort of understanding that sometimes you don't know everything. For a guy that knows everything, that's a hard concept to grasp.
But it's also like he also really stepped into it. I forget what the exact joke was recently, but he took to Twitter or X and he's like, oh, apparently not everything I say out loud that's funny is going to translate to online. It's like, yeah, Elon Musk, that was a terrible tweet. You tweet some awful stuff, dude. Like, you might be the world's smartest person. And like you, Taylor, you know, I love SpaceX. I think it's the coolest company in the world. But my God, he is capable of some really dangerous and silly stuff.
Yeah. I mean, can't imagine somebody has his friends hyping him up more just because he's rich than Elon Musk. Why don't you sign us off here?
Sign us off because it's time to go. That's the way to do it. It's time to go over and watch the Mets hopefully win Game 3. On behalf of all of us live from Brooklyn, New York, this has been the latest edition of Common Threads. We do this every Thursday. We are live on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Twitch. Thank you so much for taking the time, and a big thanks to our guests once again, Jonae, Wartel, Rich Rubino. That's the show. Good talk. See you next week. Good night.